So first of all, I'm going to read the poem, and when I do narrative PowerPoints like this during the rest of the semester, I may read the poem. It's important to think about reading the poem aloud. And if you do that, you'll get a sense for the sound of the poem and the feel of it as you read it. Because poetry, like drama, is meant to be read aloud. Poetry is not necessarily just meant to be read in your head, just as songs are meant to be sung aloud and listened to. So, this poem was written in 1942 by the American author Theodore Roethke. My Papa's Waltz. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. So there is the brief poem, My Papa's Waltz. So the first thing we think about, as per my slideshow about reading and understanding poetry, is action and speaker, before we even get into some of the deep explication and analysis. The action is fairly simple. A small boy is being whisked off to bed by his drunken father in a waltz-like manner. The mother stands in the kitchen corner frowning, unable to stop the chaotic dance. Who is the speaker? Well, the speaker is Theodore Roethke, the author of the poem. Nothing would suggest otherwise. Nothing would suggest that Roethke has instead constructed a new speaker that is not himself. So when he uses the word I, we think of it as him, the poet. In fact, there are some biographical details about Roethke that give this credence. His father owned a greenhouse and worked with plants as a profession his entire life. So is this poem autobiographical? We're not sure of that. We're not sure that his father actually did this, although it's likely possible. But we can still say solidly that the author is the speaker. He is an adult man now looking back on his childhood, relaying to his listeners and readers an event that probably happened to him frequently. And one other thing I'd like to point out is that he is speaking to his father with the word you and your. So your is Roethke's father. Speaker's father. So he's writing this for both us, the audience who are listening and reading this, because he got this published. Roethke was a poet and a teacher, and he wanted to publish this poem. He didn't just leave it for his father to read. So we know that he's writing it to his father. That's the listener, but we're also the listeners as well. Okay, next we get into craft and technique. So it is a 4-stanza poem. It's a rhyming poem based on the pattern of rhyme we can see at the ends of the lines. So there are 4 lines per stanza. And we see that breath and death rhyme in lines 1 and 3. We look at the end word to see if it rhymes. Then we see shelf and itself rhyme. We see wrist and mist. We see head, bed, dirt, shirt. So yes, we can say that this is a rhyming poem with every other line rhyming. We might look at 2 examples here of what is called slant rhyme, dizzy and easy. The words dizzy and easy aren't an exact rhyme. Dizzy might rhyme with fizzy. Easy rhymes with sleazy, okay? But slant rhyme is in a mostly rhymed poem, rhymes that do not exactly rhyme. You have to count through the entire poem, look at all of the rhymes, notice that it is a rhyming poem, and then see, because every other line rhymes in the entire poem, the poet is making a regular rhyming pattern. And so dizzy and easy would be considered a slant rhyme in the same way that pans and countenance would be considered a slant rhyme. And as I wrote, the slant rhyme does not take away from the fact that it is a rhymed poem, because slant rhyme doesn't comprise the entire poem, it's just part of it. Is it a rhythmic poem? Yes, the lines are mostly the same length. We can count out the beats of syllables. Each line has 6 syllables, although there are occasionally 7. So let me erase these here. And then I'm going to the whiskey on your breath. That's 6 beats. Could make a small boy dizzy. That's 7. That's like I said, occasionally 7. But I hung on like death, 6. Such waltzing was not easy. And another 7. And we see that throughout, that we can count out the beats, all of the syllables are the same. So it's a rhythmic and a rhymed poem. Where might punctuation be important? That's another thing we look at. Besides the stanzas, besides the lines, besides rhyme and rhythm, each stanza ends with a period. So therefore, each stanza is self-contained, and we will therefore be able to analyze each stanza separately and then analyze them together as a whole for the whole poem. We look in the first 3 stanzas. Again, let me erase here. And then you can see that the first 3 stanzas, at the end of the second line of each stanza, there's a semicolon. And we know that a semicolon functions for us to pause longer, to pause for a longer period of time. But then we get to the 4th stanza and it's only a comma. So why would that be? Why don't we pause longer there? Perhaps, and this is my own interpretation, maybe you have a different way of thinking of it, but perhaps it's because we are now in the final stage of getting to bed. And the dance that they're doing is at its frenzied peak. The chaos is at its climax, so we cannot pause for too long. And that's why I think perhaps he used a comma. So when punctuation is used in a poem in this manner, it's a way that we can understand the poem better by analyzing it. Okay, language usage. So this poem does have regular everyday language, although you may have to look up a word like countenance, which means face or expression. The other word I think that you might have had to look up is romped. And romping is a fun, almost juvenile type dance, or kind of movement that someone will do. The verbs are generally movement oriented. Speaking of movement, hung, slid, missed, waltzed. These movement words are important to tie into the action and the theme. Other adjectives, verbs, and phrases stand out for perhaps violent connotations. Romped, battered, scraped, and beat time. We will tie these into theme in a minute. And then there's a simile we see, like death, right here on line 3. Why does he hang on like death? Death hangs on to someone when they're about to die. Perhaps they smell or taste like death. This may be what the small boy thought in his limited view of the world. I hung on like death. Maybe since it's the adult looking back at his childhood, the father has literally died. So maybe ironically, he's hanging on for dear life, thinking about his father's death. Maybe he loves his dad and doesn't want to let go. Maybe he's being abused, and there's going to be more about that later, and death relates to that. So that's a very interesting line in this poem. And it comes early in the poem, so it gives us a feel for the tone of the rest of the poem as well. That is a simile, like death. It's using the word like to compare it to death to hanging on to his father. More language usage. We have alliteration. Remember, that's consonant sounds that are the same at the beginning of words. Breath and boy, waltzing was and we, slid and shelf, battered and buckle, and even beat. These alliterations can be in close lines. You don't want to look at an alliteration from line 1 to line 10, but if there's alliteration in lines 3, 4, and 5, they're all close together. Why is this important to look at the alliteration? I don't think it's just for the sound qualities, although that's important, and for the flow of the poem. But we look at the actual letter that's used. So things like battered and buckle, right here. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. B is a very hard sound. It's not a soft letter. And that hard B perhaps suggests the literal hardness of the buckle and the battered knuckle. We can find assonance in the poem, held and step, for instance. Consonants, the R sound, ear and scraped, or the N sound, countenance and unfrown. Obviously, these repetitive sound qualities are sometimes just for smoothness and fit, but sometimes they help with understanding theme and meaning as well. And all of this ultimately gives us an understanding of the purposefulness of language in a poem. Every word is chosen by the poet very purposefully to make meaning. Okay, moving on. Simile, like death, we already discussed. We're still here on language usage. Metaphor, beat time on my head, right here. The father is not literally beating the time, but he's tapping out the rhythm of the waltz with the palm of his hand, which we know is caked hard by dirt. There's lots of sensate imagery, and remember, imagery is all 5 senses. So we have the smell of whiskey, the texture and feel of the hand and the right ear scraping, the sight of pan sliding, battered knuckle, caked palm, boy still clinging to his father's shirt at the end. And the overarching metaphor we have is the waltz itself compared to the father-son relationship. My Papa's Waltz. A waltz is a beautiful rhythmic and smooth dance. It has 3 beats. There are actually 3 beats per line in this poem too. But the way we think about a waltz, it's one of those ballroom dances that we love to watch people do. The irony of this metaphor, though, is that the dance, because the dad is drunk coming home, is chaotic and frenzied. Is it still beautiful, though? Is it beautiful in a different, though ironic way? And that brings up the themes. So after we've gone through action, speaker, craft and technique, language usage, such as the literary devices, then we get into the themes. And there are actually 2 competing themes that are the ones that most people reading this poem think about and ponder and understand or possibly expressed. That doesn't mean there aren't more. As long as you can find evidence in the poem that expresses your idea of the theme, then you can say that that's the theme. But let me just go over one of them and then the second one that competes with this one. One theme is that this is a poem about father-son love, reminiscence, and nostalgia that also incisively represents the idea of alcoholism. So Rethke's father probably many nights dances his son off drunkenly to bed. The right ear of the son scrapes the buckle of the father's belt because he is so young. He's probably around 3 to 6 years old. The knuckle is battered because his father is a hard laborer during the day. And remember, his father owned and operated a greenhouse in real life. The mother sees this often, and the dance is so exaggerated and chaotic through the dad's drunkenness. Remember, it's so hard that he bumps into the kitchen shelf and the pans go to the floor, that she can't really do anything but stand in a corner and watch. But there's nothing ominous about this. She just watches and frowns because this is her kitchen and she's going to have to clean it up. He's clinging to the shirt at the end because he doesn't want the dance to end. It's fun, memorable, and exciting to a little kid. But the adult speaker's perspective allows us to understand the alcoholism that is inherently a part of this. This is how an alcoholic would come home. Maybe the mother is frowning because she's tired of him coming home drunk every night. So there is a little bit of a threat and a little bit of a notion of that ominousness in the poem, perhaps not with the mother in the corner, but perhaps with the idea of hanging on like death and the drunkenness that's represented. Still, that doesn't overshadow the reminiscence and nostalgia and the love and the excitement perhaps that's being showcased here. So that's one theme that's often considered when people read and interpret My Papa's Waltz. So let's move on to the next theme that's a competing theme. Some students and critics have suggested that readers respond to this poem, especially in the past 20 years or so, when more ideas about this subject have been brought to the forefront, as a metaphor for the abuse that the speaker endured from his father. There is evidence in the poem to support that view. So, of course, we already talked about the simile like death could be a roundabout way of the young boy's feelings as his father was abusing him. I mean, would a 4-year-old think as his father is hitting him with a belt, am I going to die because this hurts so much? The mother not being able to unfrown her face. Instead of it being an alcoholic wife's frown at his destruction, it's the frown of a woman who may also be abused and can do nothing about it, and is watching her son being abused by her husband. There are other violent words too: battered, scraped, and beat time. People even think about being hit with a belt as a common symbol of abuse, and the buckle of the belt is referenced in the poem. So here's a question: if this is a metaphor for abuse, if the waltz is a metaphor for abuse, why is the young boy, Rethke, still clinging to his father's shirt, even when he gets to bed? Abused children still love their parents when they're kids. They know no different than the abuse. They want the abuse to end, and sometimes they even feel that they are the cause of it. So the clinging would be his way of trying to feel loved. It's very profound to think of it this way. It's profound to think of it the other way too, but in a much different way. So these competing themes are very intriguing. Rethke chose words, chose the way he wrote it, chose the metaphor of the waltz, similes, and even things like the alliteration and the rhyme to express all of this. Let's move on. I have one final slide. Here are some final thoughts. All poems can be read this way. I've just spent 20 minutes on this. This is my longest lecture / slideshow yet. And I know it may be long to get through, but understanding that every poem we can go through in this way may take a long time. Do you as a reader ultimately agree with interpretation number 1, interpretation number 2, or something else? As long as you provide evidence and rationale for your points, Your analysis is valid. Finally, you may question, why do we do this? Why do we explicate a poem? Especially if a poem is an expression of words meant to entertain and move us through their creativity and imagination. Why analyze it in such detail? Isn't that ironic? Isn't that past the point? And yes, I think of that sometimes too. But in my mind, the analysis helps us understand it better, more thoroughly, and therefore we can appreciate it more. And analysis gives us new insights that we may not have thought about upon a first, or even a third, or even a 10th reading. Every time I come to a poem, I see something a little bit new. Whether it's one word that I interpret differently, or a scene, or something even more major. And if you think about songs that you love, especially those with depth in the lyrics, you can see their relationship to poetry. Although much poetry does not repeat its sentences or stanzas like a song does with lyrics, especially the refrain of a song, a poem is still memorable. In fact, before writing, humans memorized poetry in the form of song as a way of remembering their lives and telling stories to subsequent generations. So this was a very detailed analysis and explication of My Papa's Waltz. And I hope you go back to My Papa's Waltz one more time, read it aloud, and think about all of these things, and consider these kinds of issues as you read the rest of the poems on the syllabus as we get into our poetry unit. Okay, everybody. Bye-bye.